in layman's terms, IR35 are working rules effectively that apply to a worker, which is often known as a contractor, that is providing their services to an end client. So an end client could be any organisation in the public sector, private sector, charities, and it effectively governs the way that contractors are taxed. And it's based on a set of criteria and rules, if you like, that will look at the way in which they're undertaking their work and they're performing their work, both contractually and in terms of their working practices. And HMRC then wants the engager to determine whether they should be paying tax as an employee would, or whether they are working in what they call business of their own right. So they're providing services as a genuine third-party service provider, which is normally constitute more of a B2B relationship. Commonly known as IR35, but the technical term is this is the off-payroll legislation. The off-payroll legislation is the legislation that it governs private sector and public sector companies to be responsible for this determination process to decide the way in which contractors work in. Well, the new rules have just been rolled out into the private sector. Well, I say just in April 2021. They've been in the public sector since 2017. It's become quite a prickly and complex subject because the legislation, how you define the difference between someone working in the capacity of an employee or working in the capacity of a genuine contractor or consultant, if you like, in a B2B arrangement, has not been particularly straightforward for organisations to implement. So you need a really consistent and robust process. There's been some huge fines in the public sector ranging from 10 million to hundreds of millions. So private sector organisations are now becoming very aware of what could potentially be on the horizon if they get this wrong. But also, just to compound all that, the Liz Trust's ill-fated period as PM brought the subject back into the spotlight because the rules were reversed and then very quickly brought back in again. And because those rules came in recently and then were reversed and then brought back in very quickly, it's created a bit of media attention around what it actually means, and has kind of brought a bit more of a focus back onto it for organisations that it impacts. If you are the engager of the contractor and you don't take and you get it wrong, you're liable for the contractor's taxes, which means that they take the payment that you've made to the contractor as a net payment. So effectively you have to gross that up. You then have to pay all the employer's taxes on top of that as well, including the apprenticeship levy. You can have further penalties for not taking reasonable care if they don't think that you have implemented the right process and frameworks in your organisation to manage this. And if you've been negligent or tried to really hide how you've been operating and hide these, try and find ways of covering up work, you can be fined up to 100% of the tax owed. So depending on the level of non-compliance, you can be talking about extremely significant sums of money. Yeah, it does. Any organisation that meets two of the following key criteria is classified as a medium or large size organisation. So if you've got a turnover of 10.2 million or more, a balance sheet of 5.1 million or more than 50 employees, you'll be caught by the legislation, i.e. the legislation applies to you. So you need to meet two of those criteria. And if you meet two of those criteria, you need to be aware of the off-payroll legislation. Firstly, I think it's really important to stress, if you put the work in and you get the right frameworks in place, you can reduce your risk to a very, very low level. I often think of it as being sort of likened to GDPR. When that first came in, It was a really complex issue. Everyone was panicked and stressed. How are we going to sort of put all these processes in place and manage it all? Now it's just part of business as usual for organisations. And really, the new off payroll rules are very similar in principle. It's complicated at the moment. It's difficult to understand it because it's fairly complex. You've got to educate everybody internally. But if you do all these things and then you manage it ongoing and you have an ongoing process and framework there, the risk is very low. You're very unlikely to be caused any issues by it. However, if you fail to do that and you bury your head in the sand somewhat, or you look at it, you think it's complicated, or you think you're not at risk, or you think you're just going to wait to get a letter from HMRC, yeah, your risk could be really significant, and it compounds over the time. You can't backdate compliance because they'll want to see, if they launch an investigation, they'll want to see copies of old contracts. They'll want to see if they've got any issues with anything. They're going to want to delve into proof of working practices that meet the criteria for an off-payroll engagement. They'll lift up every stone and look at exactly how how your engagement contract has been operating. So you can't just suddenly get a letter from HMRC and try and sort of fix everything retrospectively. It's very unlikely to work, and that's when you're in trouble. So the best thing to do is to just take it seriously now, and just get everything in place, and then just manage it as part of your day-to-day. And at that point, you can be fairly comfortable that your risk is going to be very low. You can't just rely on insurance. I think that's a really, really risky approach. If you're just taking out insurance to cover non-compliance of IR35, and depending on how you're going about it, the insurance, check your small print, but the insurance will only cover you if you've taken the right care and you've applied the process correctly. So, for example, when you're actually looking at each individual engagement, did the person that undertake the engagement have deep and strong knowledge of IR35? Were they applying the questions and criteria correctly in order to come to the right conclusion? A bit like car insurance. Just because you get car insurance, it doesn't mean you can drive around recklessly or hand the keys to someone that doesn't have a license. The idea is you don't want to be in a crash in the first place for all sorts of reasons. Defending yourself against an IR35 investigation is absolutely no fun. They can drag on for years and years, and the cost of fortune in defence. Even if you are insured, you've got to look at the amount of insurance that you're covered for and how much an investigation that drags on for years could actually end up costing you, the pain and the stress of it, especially you're the stakeholder. The reality is you just don't want to get an investigation. You want HMRC to come to you and say, how are you handling IR35? What's your processes? How many contractors you've got? Ask all those questions and be able to say, this is how we're dealing with it. Here's a report on it. Here's every contractor we've got. Here's how often we're assessing them. And here's why we're extremely confident that we're managing the process correctly. And the belief is then that HMRC will go and look for lower hanging fruit, quite frankly. So we provide an end-to-end process which manages all IR35 compliance from cradle to grave. That involves a technology platform which underpins our service, but the main benefit of how we do it is everything is overseen by human IR35 experts. The platform is really there to streamline, coordinate the entire process, manage the records of compliance, manage the assessments, make sure that the check-ins are undertaken and record those check-ins, store it in an accessible data room that a customer always has access to, so they can download any data when they need to. And the platform really underpins our whole service. We start by helping with the identification of contractors within your organisation. So that's the first step. Once they're identified, we undertake all the initial assessments. And then we will, against each supplier, we'll understand what we think their risk profile is, and therefore how regular the check-ins and reassessments need to be. And then that will all be scheduled on the platform, and then our experts will then make sure that the check-ins are undertaken on time, the reassessments are undertaken on time, and that everyone that is undertaking these assessments is educated through the process in ensuring that they're answering the questions correctly and understanding the context of the legislation. And as part of this whole service, we're offering training via our portals to both contractors and line managers. So we're increasing the understanding of the legislation throughout the organisation, which again helps safeguard against any misinterpretation. Well, in a way, yes, we are once we get everything implemented. So what we're acting as is the internal compliance officer. There's some upfront work we do to make sure that the right framework and process is in place. But once that's implemented, we manage everything and we interact with our customers regularly to let them know about any issues, risks, or impediments that we might come up against. But actually the day-to-day management of it is all taken off their hands. So everything really is just there, and our customers can just have a look at our progress at any particular time without actually having to worry about doing anything further than that internally. Well, your first and obvious step should be to contact us. But if you are looking to do something internally and you want to know what you should start with, the first thing I would do is research IR35 and the off-payroll legislation, and actually trying to have a really clear understanding of what it is, what the risks are, and what's required. Understand, obviously, if your organisation matches the risk profile, and if there is an issue there for you, and start to try and work out if you've got the internal capability, knowledge, and experience to manage it, and you think you can get the right frameworks and steps in place to do that internally. Don't just see it as a risk. This presents an opportunity because IR35 impacts the vast majority of medium, large size organisations in the UK, private and public sector. And that means that those that ignore it and don't do anything are obviously at risk, but also it means that putting the right frameworks in place and being an organisation that is managing it correctly can give you access to an amazing array of talent that's available. Lots and lots of experts are now operating on a contracting basis. They want a portfolio CV. The gig economy is just growing and growing. By not embracing the change in legislation, you're actually cutting yourself off from a huge amount of talent and organisational flexibility, which during such uncertain economic times seems like probably not an ideal strategic move.